Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsey Sharman. I'm the curator of the Art Gallery of Alberta. I'm very happy to be introducing our event this evening, which is a screening of Anna Hawkins' new film, Blue, Light, Blue, and then a conversation with Anna and a look into her exhibition that's at the AGA. Anna's exhibition, also titled Blue, Light, Blue, is up right now at the Art Gallery of Alberta, and although we remain closed to the public, that exhibition will be ready whenever health restrictions allow us to open to the public again. So Anna Hawkins works primarily in moving image and installation. She's completed a BA in art history at the University of Pittsburgh and received an MFA from Concordia University. And she's currently assistant professor in fine art at MacEwan University. Anna, I, and the AGA, we're all situated on Treaty 6 territory. We are also in Edmonton, and this and Treaty 6 are a traditional land of diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the Indigenous Inuit and Métis people who make Edmonton and Alberta their home today. So this evening, we are going to watch Anna's film in its entirety. So it's about 15 minutes, after which I have some questions for Anna. And if anyone watching has any questions about the video or Anna's practice, you can just put them in the chat at any time. I'll be monitoring it throughout. So before I invite Anna to come introduce the film, I'd like to thank EPCOR for their support. Our online programming is brought to you because of the generous support of the EPCOR Heart and Soul Fund. I'd also like to thank Canada Council for the Arts for their support of our online programming. And Anna's exhibition is also in the RBC Gallery at the AGA and was sponsored by RBC. And so thank you to them for their ongoing support of artists. So Anna, would you like to join me and set the stage for your film for us? Hi.
Hi, thanks, Lindsay. Hi, thanks so much. Yeah, I just want to also kind of reiterate that I'm also joining today from Treaty 6 territory and Amiskwacy Waskaikin, and just thinking in all of these digital virtual events that we're taking up so much of our time right now, it's good to kind of think about where we are physically located and the history of that place. And also just really want to thank you, Lindsay. It's been a real pleasure working on this exhibition with you and with the whole team at the AGA. I've really enjoyed working on this exhibition and hope that people will be able to see it. Fingers crossed, we'll see. So yeah, before we watch the film, I don't want to say too much, but just to kind of introduce it, it's a work that I started about 2 years ago, and the production for it largely unfolded over 2 summers. So the summer of 2019, I shot a lot of it while on a residency in Sackville, New Brunswick, and then I continued working on it last summer in semi-lockdown here in Edmonton. And so the theme of the work and sort of responding to blue light, so the type of light that is emanated from our screens and devices, I think since I've begun this project has become something that maybe people have become more aware of or thinking more about their exposure to this type of light and what that means. You'll see in the work that I'm kind of adopting a sort of reference to horror film and the horror genre. And that came about kind of from a previous work that I had done. And I knew that this was a genre that I wanted to explore. And when I started working on this project, I saw a lot of news pieces and kind of clickbait headlines about blue light, and a lot of the stock imagery really looked like stills from horror films. So there would be often female figures in a bed in a darkened room with this super intense blue light emanating from a device. So I kind of that's where I started to link these things together. And as the project had progressed, I decided that I wanted to work with 16 millimeter film as well as digital video. And so as you watch the work, you'll see that there are kind of two perspectives, and maybe you could even see it as two different characters that are characterized by these two different formats. So the film footage is often shot in a sort of POV, first-person perspective in kind of a handheld manner. And the video footage is often a more objective camera, more stationary, although those rules are broken within the work as well, but it was something to maybe think about in watching it. So I think maybe I'll stop there, and hopefully we can talk a lot more after we watch the work.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so there we go. Thank you. Amazing. Congrats.
Thank you.
Right. So I'd like to show a little bit about what the installation looks like. So we have some images here. So this is, when you first walk in, text panel, and I guess here's a drawing that's also in the space. So in the exhibition, there is this one drawing and the video. And I think if I go one more, yeah. So here you can kind of see like a little bit of what the full installation looks like. So the video is projected on the back of this wall. But the first thing that you see when you come in the space, you're sort of confronted with this drawing. And the imagery of the lamppost is also something that kind of shows up throughout the film. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about the significance of the lamppost itself as like an image, and also the drawing.
Mm-hmm, sure. So this kind of bit of the film sort of emerged over this past summer, and as I was doing sort of more research for the project, and thinking about the history of artificial lighting, and thinking about devices as light emitting rather than just sort of communication and conduits of information. So thinking of them as devices that essentially emit light. In sort of researching like histories of artificial lighting, which maybe this is obvious, but I hadn't really connected the idea that artificial lighting and lighting in public spaces has always been kind of connected to ideas of surveillance and societal control and intervention by governments. So thinking about how people felt when even gaslighting, when gas lines were installed into private homes, it was a real infiltration of larger, governmental forces coming into really intimate domestic spaces in a way that was quite uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people. So thinking about that and thinking about the lamppost as the symbol of potentially, as I said, surveillance in that way. I had also, in reading this in a book that I had been reading about this called Disenchanted Night, which is about sort of the industrialization of light, I had come across this political cartoon that was created during the French Revolution, where there are these sort of anthropomorphized lampposts that are pursuing a French general. And so the idea that then this lamppost, which is the symbol of the Ancien Regime, is like then overturned by the people and taken to its own source, I thought was a really interesting image. And also just, I was just really drawn to these lampposts that were like wearing boots and had these sort of faces, that imagery. So I kind of brought that in this work. I brought that together. So some of the imagery of these sort of blue legs that appear in the video work incorporated into this imagery from that source, that political cartoon. And then that political cartoon is also featured on screen in the film at one point as well.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to advance a little bit so we can have a look at what the video looks like in the space. So in your introduction, you spoke a little bit about kind of your interest in horror and like horror tropes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that interest, if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this stems from the project that I did just before this one, which was called Fall, Fell, Felt, which was a work which was largely using a lot of appropriated imagery from fail videos, and specifically the genre of girl fails. And so I became kind of interested in applying some ideas from feminist film critique to these sort of internet-based internet sources, and specifically this genre. So thinking about sort of feminist readings of film, where the idea that female bodies are often ones that are used to transmit these sort of somatic responses, these really intense physical responses. So in that work, I think there is even though it's taking these kind of humorous videos, there is like an element of horror there. And in screening the work at one point in a large auditorium of students, actually at Concordia, there was a moment when there was like a moment of suspense and something happened and someone in the audience like very loudly gasped. And I just thought it was so amazing to have such like a audible, tangible, like sort of response. And just thinking about that and thinking about horror as a genre that elicits these like very bodily responses sometimes, where you're physically like jolted, but also thinking about that as a way of like, horror is like a genre where you really get immersed in it and caught up in those emotions and reactions. But often as soon as you have one, you immediately kind of get bumped out of the experience, and you sort of realize that you're a body sitting in a chair in a theater or in front of your computer. So like those two types of awarenesses of something that I've been interested for a while in my work, I think, of kind of breaking the illusion of the screen. Mm-hmm. So then, yeah, I think from that, I knew that I wanted to kind of explore this genre more.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in that in the felt video. Mm-hmm. The thing that I thought was like so jarring about that is like, so it's a collection of found footage of fail videos, but you always like cut right before like the actual fail, so right before somebody falls or like does whatever, and I think it's something that you also kind of play with in this video as well. And it is definitely something that's employed a lot in horror, where you kind of cut right before, and there's just like something about it that makes it so much more visceral than actually, seeing the fall and then you kind of laugh. I think it's something that like turns it very like quickly and very easily from like humor into horror. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In those videos and in your previous work as well, you're often using found footage, but this one you're actually using your own body. I'm not sure. So have you used yourself as an actor in previous videos? And I guess maybe like what was that like in kind of using your own body to kind of investigate this a little bit more?
It has been an element in my previous, I would say, 2 projects that I have been interacting with the found footage, and it has been myself who has been the actor in those works as well. But this is the first work in a very long time that I've made that does not incorporate found footage. Well, I suppose there is like when like the hammer hits the screen, that hammer is actually taken from a YouTube video, but that's the only moment that's sort of like under a second of footage. So that was something that from the last work, I kind of knew. I think as time had gone on, for a few years, I was working exclusively with found footage. And so gradually I've been injecting more original footage, often of myself, into the work. And then I kind of knew that for this work, to sort of almost as a challenge to myself and also just to create new ways of working, I decided I didn't really want to work that way for this piece. So yeah, I guess I have been working with myself in the footage, and in a lot of ways, I think partially that's due to a fact of just like, when I make my works, I make them like by myself. Like I that's the way I prefer to work. It's sort of not, even though film and video often like requires collaboration. But I kind of like to do it in my own way, because I also think that I work in a way of like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just always kind of like experimenting and trying different things, and to think about trying to direct someone else, I don't really know how that would work. But also just, I think conceptually in the works that I'm often kind of like investigating like a hypothesis. So like I had a work called How to Chop an Onion, where I was sort of trying to think about how we learn things online from instructional videos, et cetera. So like the process of me enacting those things or repeating those gestures was sort of like testing how that happens in a very loose way. And the same with the last project, where I was sort of interested in how or why videos of fail videos are so captivating and why they have such a physical effect on us. And it was sort of like testing that effect on myself in some ways. In this work, I'm not sure if that applies quite as much, because there's a lot more narrative here than has been in my previous works. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also, I just wanted to take a moment to remind our audience that if they have any questions for you, that they can go ahead and add them into the chat at any time. So I'm just going to advance a little bit. So there are a few kind of recurring visual elements in the film. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk about them a little bit, how you chose them, and what you hope that those elements achieve. And while you're talking, I might just click through the images.
Sure. Yeah, so I think in my head, or in my organizing of the pseudo, like not really script of this, but the shot list as I organized this work, I did divide it into chapters. And partially that was an organizing way of working for me, because this work, just by its nature, had to unfold in a very different way than I normally work, because I normally work primarily in video, and I do a lot of just visual experiments, creating a lot of imagery. But working in film, I knew I had to have a bit more of a script and a plan. And I also kind of, in knowing that I wanted to work more with narrative, I knew that I might have to sort of script this out a bit more. So I kind of started by just collecting a bunch of images that I wanted to include in the film in a document, and then just sort of ended up grouping them around these themes, thinking about like, one I think would be like mirror or glass like surfaces, and thinking about how all of these things kind of relate to screens. So the screen is a reflective surface. It's also sort of like a window that you look through. And then also thinking about, there's the one segment that I associate more with like the candle, flame, smoke, light in that way. So thinking about these devices as, like I said, sort of light sources. And then a third chapter, which is more like, I think it's like, it's a little bit not as neat, like maybe it's like water and like the curtain / window. And just thinking about maybe the screen as this sort of like, it feels like a permeable layer or surface that we can kind of like see through and traverse into, although of course that's an illusion. But yeah, so I think it was kind of like, once I had all of these images that I knew I wanted to work with, it was kind of like just a matter of like figuring out how to organize them. And so these themes were something I was thinking about, and just thinking about, once again, the idea of the screen as being like, yeah, the guiding principle here, and just thinking about all the different meanings of that word screen, and how it can be something that you project something onto, or something that is a boundary between like indoor and outdoor, or different types of spaces. So yeah, so I think that's, I guess, what to say. And then there are some other sort of imagery of like the lock also that sort of appears, and that's kind of like ideas, once again, of, yeah, boundaries and different interior and exterior space, private and public space, and those kind of ideas come up with the curtain as well. So yeah, long-winded answer, sorry.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. So I do have a question from the chat. So you did just mention your kind of interest in narrative or loose in a narrative, and they're wondering if you can say a little bit more about narrative in this work. Was there a story or a hint of one for you in the planning stage of this work?
Hi, Tamer. Nice to see you. I wish I could see you, but nice to see your name there. Yeah, I think, well, I guess it began with just a desire to work with narrative, which I haven't, as I said before. I think in my previous work, one kind of emerged in the process, and it just made me realize I wanted to work with it. But it was a challenge for me to kind of think in that way. So I guess there was a hint of one just in the sense of, as soon as I kind of decided that I wanted to use these two different formats, 16mm film, and then actually it's 4K video. So thinking about the differences of those two formats, I sort of, like I said, began to think of them almost as two characters. And so whether one is like the protagonist and one is the antagonist or the villain or whatever, I don't know. And they're kind of the same person ultimately, but thinking about it in that way was one way I started to think about it. And then I knew it would kind of work in these cycles of day and night that would become potentially increasingly confusing, although I think maybe they're just confusing from the outset at this point. But yeah, so I knew that was also like going to be set up on these cycles of day and night that are become more and more confused. So that was basically the hint of narrative that I began with.
Mm-hmm. Could you expand a little bit more on like how the film is made, and a little bit more maybe like the technical side of like using the 16mm and the 4K and the different kind of filming tactics that you were using?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the desire to use film for this project, I hadn't used like 16mm film since I had very first begun working with moving images. So it'd been quite a long time. And I think I was just sort of interested in how these two mediums capture light so very differently. And how one thing I was thinking about was specifically that 16mm film, you know, it's balanced for tungsten and daylight. And so these like screens, you know, the whole idea of blue light is why it is kind of confusing for us is that it mimics daylight, but it's not daylight. So I kind of wanted to see how 16mm film would respond to that sort of light source. So that was maybe a beginning point with knowing that I wanted to work with that, and just thinking about how I would work with these two different vantage points, often like filming the same thing with both cameras and combining the footage in the same frame, often because masking is kind of like something that appears in collage type work, appears in my work very often. So I knew that would probably come back. So wanting to sort of have these two different looks in the work, but then also combine them at certain times, just to talk about those two perspectives. And I guess, you know, for me, I'm really interested in how whatever image capturing technology we have becomes so much a part of, well, I think really influences the way we see the world. Like it shifts how we act in the world. It shifts how we present ourselves, you know, like thinking about like, I remember like when HD video first appeared on the market, like there was all this, like a new lines of makeup appeared that were specifically like targeted for HD resolution. And then also I think, you know, with Instagram and filters and like things like that, like the way that we actually shape how we appear in the world based on image making technologies, and also how our collective sort of memory of a time exists based on how those appear. So I was thinking about all those things in working on with the film. So I was shooting in tandem the film footage and the video footage. So technically I was shooting those like in the same day, you know, sometimes. And like I said, for me, it was a big adjustment because I'm very used to working like where I'll shoot a little bit of video and then I do a lot of sort of work with effects. So I usually shoot a little bit, play around with it, and then gather more as needed. But with film, obviously I had to work on a different timeline and basically do a bunch of shooting before I started the editing process. So that was a big difference. And then I guess I would just say lastly, like that I think another reason that I found the film footage to be interesting to work with was because in sort of like, I really have enjoyed working with found images, in many ways because of the limitations that gives me. I think with video, like, when I'm shooting original footage, I can just reshoot and shoot and get so much footage that it's hard to know when to stop. And I've always like appreciated like found footage for, the limits it presents and what it might present that I wouldn't have expected. In a lot of ways, I've started creating my own footage in the same way, where I'm often end up using shots that were just like, they weren't intended to be in the final work, but then I kind of appropriate them as if they were found footage. And with film the same way, not knowing exactly what I was going to get, I felt like I had that limitation, which I find to be like productive.
So Leslie Sharp is asking, so she's interested in the other light that's in the film, which I think you were talking about a little bit as she put this question up. So she says, the film light, the natural light that gets disrupted and infiltrated, especially since film is another early technology. Were you specifically interested in how those work together? And oh no, I don't know this book, and so I think I'm going to butcher this name. So, and she's asking, did the Shivelbush book influence that?
Well, I'm not sure if I totally understand, but thank you, Leslie, so much. I think, like thinking about how the film light and the natural light that gets disrupted and infiltrated. I mean, I think I was sort of in some ways I also, in a maybe sort of simplistic way, thought about like the film as the more like naturalistic element. Like, a lot of film buffs will still argue that film is a more, it captures light in a more true way than digital video. I mean, I'm sure there are many perspectives on that, but sort of thinking of that as being like more tied to actual daylight when we're seeing that. And so that sense that it's often being infiltrated by the blue light, which is definitely true, is happening time and time again. And I just was thinking about sort of like that idea that like, I don't know, when we're constantly in front of screens, it's really, I mean, I feel like it just ends up like no matter where we are, that light is present. It comes with us wherever we go. It's like literally on our bodies, like at all times with our phones, maybe not on, but often is. So just thinking about how it sort of bleeds into that. And so also just how our experiences or what we see online ends up bleeding into what we see like in the real world, in the outer world. So I hope that answers your question, Leslie. If not, let me know. And I would say that the Shivelbush book that I referenced earlier, and I think you actually did read this as well, Lindsay, that's the one on the industrialization of light. So just thinking about, I actually read that kind of in the second half of my research. So was just kind of thinking about more about that sort of, that maybe came later, but so I guess I would say from the beginning, I was sort of interested in always having these two types of light merging and blending, specifically having the blue light kind of seeping into the more like 16 millimeter film light, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Nicole is asking about the soundtrack, which I'm also super interested in, because this was one of the last elements that you added. And so you and I have not really even talked a lot about the soundtrack. So she's wondering the inspiration for the soundtrack. And she also has a second question. She's also wondering if you experience any challenges filming a year apart and half in New Brunswick and half in Edmonton.
Great. Thank you. So the soundtrack, it was sort of the last element. And it was made collaboratively. I can't even say the word collaboration. I was going to say, I don't normally work collaboratively. But for the soundtrack, I worked with my partner, who's also an artist. And obviously there's a lot of quotation happening with synth-based soundtracks for horror film. Obviously, there's a lot of association with that genre, and so I knew I kind of wanted to go in that way, but I was also really concerned about it becoming too much of a parody or too too nostalgic, I guess, were my concerns. But I think that there's also such an interesting history of how filmmakers and directors have worked with synthesizers, because they are so low budget, and often directors themselves can kind of score films because of the accessibility of synthesized soundtracks, and also just the importance of the soundtrack in horror film, as often like that's a way to communicate a perspective of either the monster or the slasher, or communicate the perspective of the victim or protagonist. So it adds so much to the texture of the work, and the way that you can kind of have such a large soundscape existing with that was sort of where I wanted to approach it. I mean, I guess, like I said, it's obviously there's going to be a lot of quotation there, and I was concerned about that a lot in the work, but eventually I just sort of embraced it, I guess. But yeah, and I think another reason I would say is that I don't also normally work with like a musical score for my works, but in the way that I think this work plays a lot with like immersing you in it, and then kind of like panning back, and you realize that you're seeing something different, or you're kind of like the illusion is broken. So I wanted to use like a musical score to kind of work, like to draw you in, and then also like create that rupture. Yeah, so I guess that hopefully that answers it. And then thinking about the filming a year apart, yeah, I definitely did pose some challenges. I think just thinking about the landscape in New Brunswick does factor in quite largely into the work. So then kind of transposing it here in Edmonton was a challenge, although I was doing a lot of sort of reshoots, filling things in, more like detail shots. And I think it also just posed a challenge because mentally, like where we all were in the summer of 2020 was a very different place than we were in the summer of 2019. So I think thinking about that was a challenge also, just thinking about approaching a project from in such a different headspace. But yeah, so I guess it did pose challenges, but because of the types of things that I was shooting, my not huge concern with maintaining a whole lot of like breaking the consistency was okay with me. And I was able to use the same model of camera. So that sort of visual consistency was still there, but I think it also shifted the work in a way that I think was beneficial to the work in the end. So yeah, thanks.
You just mentioned a little bit of this, kind of like this panning back. I think it's like an interesting element in the film of this, you're constantly like tricked into like not quite knowing what you're looking at, or not quite knowing like how many screens you're looking through at any given time. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of like trickery, I guess, in the film?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that's maybe something that's been consistently an interest in my work. Like I think that like the surface of the screen is something that in past works as well, I'm always kind of interested in breaking apart, sort of rupturing that surface and playing with it. Like thinking about it once again, as I was talking about with those sort of metaphorical like themes that appear in the work, is something that's like a space that feels like it's that we can traverse and go into, but then ultimately is just like a flat surface. And then always kind of reminding, I guess, the viewer of that, but playing with that has been something that I'm always really interested in thinking about. And then also just, I think, distraction is a big part of our lives right now, especially, but something that I was thinking about with the work as well. And just so often you're kind of being drawn into something, and then all of a sudden, a window, like a computer, a browser window rather, closes, or something shifts all of a sudden, and it's kind of like hard, you get distracted. And just sort of thinking about that. And another of the books that was kind of influential early on in the research for this project was Jonathan Crary's book 24/7. And he kind of talks about how like being an uninterrupted spectator is like completely outmoded, that every time we're looking at something, we're constantly like clicking to go forward, or clicking to skip the ad, or reviewing it, or rating it, or like there's some interaction involved. And this idea of like being completely immersed as a spectator for a long period of time is something that it's very hard to achieve now. And so sort of thinking about that in the work as well is sort of like, yeah, all of those things.
So was there some motivation in wanting a full screening of the film so you could?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's true. Because, yeah, exactly. Because I know myself that right now it's really hard to sit down and like, well, I'm in front of a screen all day for everything, for work, for studio practice, for friendships, you know, for everything. So I think it's really hard to dedicate time, a block of time. So yeah, I guess I you know, I can imagine having the best of intentions to sit down and watch a 15-minute film, but it might be very hard. So thank you all for everyone for being here today and watching. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for everybody's attention. Yeah, I mean, I guess you touched just briefly on, you know, the pandemic had kind of changed your way of working and how you were actually able to produce the film. But I wonder if it's changed how you think about it, the imagery that you were using in it. I think it's interesting that, you know, these themes of kind of having your life mediated through screens and being kind of always at the mercy of this blue light was definitely relevant before the pandemic, but now I think it's kind of like tenfold.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, so I mean, I guess maybe it has shifted in some ways. I mean, I think a lot of the ideas were already in the work, but as you're saying, that maybe the experience has been amplified a bit in the past 12 months. So I think also that, I think one thing that I wanted to work with in the film was just feeling like this feeling of sort of disorientation that comes from being exposed to your screen for an extended period of time, and just sort of this disorientation of time and place and time of day, et cetera, but also just thinking about how like, I think I was recently listening to something on, I think the CBC, or about how memory is even being shifted in this pandemic, because it's really hard to kind of grasp time when every day kind of feels the same. And you sort of can't remember if something happened like a day ago or like 3 weeks ago, because it all kind of like that sort of blurry sense of time and disorientation of distinguishing markers of time is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which I hope that the work kind of like maybe captures in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think even just like this image that we're looking at here of like the strawberries, and they kind of like evaporate into smoke or kind of go bad before your eyes. But yeah, I think it's definitely like I've lost all sense of the timeline. Like I have no idea when anything was.
Yeah, exactly.
So actually, now that we're on this image, like the strawberries, they do show up like a few times, kind of repeatedly. Did you want to expand a little bit on that?
Sure. I mean, I think this is something that came out of like in the editing process. Like I was shooting them when I was on residency, and not knowing sort of how they fit into anything. And then this work specifically, like what you're seeing is a shot on 16mm film that was shot of this bowl of strawberries sitting on this chair. And then I had reshot the same bowl of strawberries with like intense blue lights with the video camera from a slightly different angle, and then transpose that on top of it. So you're sort of seeing this video image that you can kind of see like there's a more harsh sort of glare on the strawberries, a reflection in that portion of it. So collapsing those two images together. And so, yeah, I think this was something that I just sort of was shot a few times with the 16mm film and with the video as kind of like a test subject in a lot of ways. It was something I just had around in the apartment where I was staying. So sort of, I just had this footage, but I really liked the footage and I knew I wanted to include it. So it kind of happens at what I think of as these sort of different chapters. So as we move from one to another, the strawberries reappear. So they reappear here. There's one time where you sort of see them reflected in the the phone itself, and then another time at the end where the strawberries are being chopped. So it's sort of like they just sort of signal the shift, I guess, which is maybe not perceptible to anyone but me, but that was like how I perceived them in the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a couple of questions related to, are there art historical quotations in the work, in particular, like the mingling of screens and still life, maybe Willem Calf in this dangling orange peel, or maybe Duchamp in the leg.
Mm-hmm. The only direct sort of quotation, I guess I would say, of another artwork, I think, is the leg. But I was actually thinking of one of my favorite films, Syntagma by Valley Export, where there's a sequence in the work where there is an actress who is on a bed, and she's sort of interacting with these images of herself. So it's like an image of her arm, and then she places, and then there's a photo print of an arm, and then the actress like lays her arm beside it, and they interact in this way. That's really compelling, and I love that work. So I was kind of thinking about that work, and so instead I have it like it's in front of I have the image of my leg on the TV, and then my actual leg sort of steps in to sort of interact with it. That part has been shot on film. And so just thinking about the interaction of like the body and the image, that's such a big part, I guess, of my work in a lot of ways. So that's kind of a nod there. As far as like other, like, I mean, certainly to the genre of still life, there are some nods, but I wasn't thinking of any specific works with those. I just kind of, that was one of the images that I knew early on that I wanted to have. Like, I just knew that I wanted to have a film shot of the still life that would gradually, the objects would be replaced by the video footage of the same stuff. So the blue sort of lit video imagery would sort of overtake that still life. And that was just something that I knew I wanted in there from sort of the beginning of working on the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe can you talk a little bit about this kind of like layering of smoke? I know that you spoke just a little bit about kind of like the smoke is more like a broader element, but if you could talk maybe about this like juxtaposition of like this smoking hand with the forest fire.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I guess actually this will contradict what I just said, because I was like, I only have one direct quotation. So this shot kind of began from the many horror films that I watched, and kind of thinking about this project. I think it was a Dario Argento film, Deep Red, where there's like a shot of someone smoking in front of a TV with like a newscaster, and the hand is sort of in soft focus, and you see what's on the TV. And I just visually, I was really compelled by that image. So I kind of wanted to bring that in somehow, that type of framing. And so it's sort of, the footage has been replaced by this imagery of forest fires, very devastating forest fires, and just the way the smoke commingles from both sources. You know, I was just sort of thinking about like, one thing, I guess, also sort of themes that run through my work, but thinking about when we're just kind of inundated with imagery like this, that's just so devastating and horrifying, and just, but not really being able to respond or act or understand is how I feel often, where it's like the more imagery I have of it, the less I kind of know how to comprehend it in some ways. So like this sort of like the smoke from a joint sort of mixing with that is like the best way to like understand it, and sort of like the way these two things sort of blur together. And obviously there's like kind of a sense of like escapism also that's happening, and just sort of like, I think the way that in this sequence then the smoke sort of follows the camera and continues is sort of thinking again more about like how what we experience on the screen ends up sort of leaking into our daily lives. So like, you know, like I said, and collapsing in some ways. So I guess that was another thought there. But yeah, this is essentially just a shot taken in front of my laptop screen, just to explain that a little bit more. Yeah.
So Taryn is curious about the blue droplets. Can you talk a little bit about what material they are? And is this the blue light becoming material or matter?
I like that idea. The idea of like the blue light becoming material, and I guess in some ways it is. I mean, literally, it's just sort of like drops of like blue food coloring that I green screened out and laid over the image. I think it was just kind of, once again, that I like in multiple ways of thinking about it, kind of like, I think I already used the term leaking, but once again, with those droplets, it's sort of really making that really material. So that idea that like the blue light is actually just like dripping onto these other surfaces, and it's not really bleeding through because it's dropping onto them as a surface, but just how it kind of starts to bleed onto the other image or the other experience. So thinking about it in that way, I guess. And I think formally, it's just like something that I'm, like I said, very interested in always playing with that idea of like surfaces and breaking or revealing that surface more. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question, but I think that's a really interesting way of saying it, thinking about it as like becoming an actual substance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's like a relation here too with like this image and kind of like how you're playing with this in a couple of instances as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I might just go back to, I'm sorry, this is a little bit, my clicker is a little bit slow. Yeah, just to kind of draw everybody's attention to this. So this is the political cartoon that you were talking about in the beginning, that comes from that book that then has the light in the back. Mm-hmm. Was there anything else that you wanted to kind of expand on with the lamppost?
I mean, I think I said most of it. I mean, I think maybe what I didn't say in like, once again, maybe this is a more simplistic reading of just like thinking about, when I saw this originally, I was like, it's light being embodied as a sort of figure, which is what drew me to it, because at that point, that was where, like I said, that was like a part of this work that had sort of been, I knew that was where this work was going to go from the beginning. So I think there was also just like a pleasure in seeing that and thinking about using that in the imagery of the work, or pulling that in somehow, just became an interest. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think we're just a few minutes past our hour. And it doesn't seem to be any more questions in the chat for you. Was there anything else that you wanted to share about the video before we kind of wrap up?
Nothing off the top of my head. If anybody wants to email me questions, my email's on my website if anything comes up. But thank you so much for all the questions. It flew by for me. So thank you so much. And also, as I said, I know that everyone's spending a lot of time on the screen. So thanks for dedicating a bit more time to spend with this.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing, for kind of like allowing us to share the whole video in its entirety. It's really, really great to be able to do that while the gallery is closed. Hopefully, fingers crossed that things will get a little bit better. Maybe our vaccine rates will catch up to our current numbers that will allow us to reopen, and everybody will be able to come and see. I think the installation is really beautiful, and you should be very proud. I think the exhibition looks really fantastic. So yeah, thanks for your time this evening, and thanks for the work, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.